You ever get that feeling? That feeling of being completely alone, like really alone, even when you're surrounded by other people.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think we all experience that at some point, regardless of like our situation or anything. It's a pretty universal part of being human, I think.
Yeah. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into that whole thing, into loneliness. We've been looking at this really interesting, really in-depth article that lays out a bunch of different strategies for how to deal with it, how to actually find some peace, maybe even, I don't know, like grow from those times when you're feeling isolated.
Yeah, and what's so great about this article, it goes beyond just offering like these quick fixes or these Band-Aid solutions. It really dives deep into the psychology of loneliness and offers some practical ways to approach it.
Exactly. And that's kind of our goal for this deep dive, to go through all these ideas and insights and pull out the stuff that's really going to be valuable for you guys, for our listeners, so you can use it to not just, get through those tough times, but maybe even like find some unexpected strength or even some self-discovery in those moments.
Yeah, it's not just about like surviving loneliness, right? It's about figuring out how to maybe even thrive when we feel lonely, which sounds kind of crazy, but it's possible.
And one of the first things the article points out, which I think is really key, is that loneliness isn't just about, physically being alone.
Yeah.
Because you can be surrounded by tons of people and still feel that deep sense of isolation, that yearning for a real connection, that feeling that something's missing.
That's so true. Like you can have a jam-packed schedule, be constantly going to events, parties, whatever, and still feel totally empty inside.
Which is wild,
yeah.
Right? Because in this day and age, we're more connected than ever with all the social media, our phones, everything.
Right.
But it feels like, in a way, it's actually harder to find that genuine connection.
Okay.
And loneliness is, like, everywhere.
It's almost like a paradox, right? We're constantly bombarded with images and updates from other people's lives, but those interactions can be so superficial, so fleeting. So yeah, we're connected in a way, but it's often not the deep, meaningful connection that we really crave as humans. It's like we're starving for real connection in a world of endless appetizers.
So the article really breaks down loneliness, dissects it. And one of the first things it does is make this distinction, this really important distinction between solitude and loneliness, which I think can be easy to mix up sometimes.
Yeah, totally. And it's super important to understand the difference, right? Because solitude's like choosing to spend time alone. That can actually be a really positive thing. It can be a chance to, reflect, to be creative, to just recharge. Loneliness, though, it's that feeling of being alone when you don't want to be. It's involuntary, and it comes with that deep longing for connection.
Right. Solitude is something you choose. Loneliness is something that's kind of thrust upon you. And then on top of that, the article goes even deeper. It starts talking about social loneliness and emotional loneliness. Can you break those down for us?
Okay, so social loneliness is basically, when you don't have that broad social network, like maybe you've moved somewhere new and you haven't had the chance to build a community yet, or maybe your circle of friends has shrunk for whatever reason. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, it's more about those close, intimate relationships, like having a best friend or a partner, someone you can really confide in, someone who truly gets you on a deep level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You could have like a ton of acquaintances, people you see regularly, but still feel that emotional loneliness. If you don't have those few people you can really be yourself with, And the article also talks about all the different things that can cause loneliness, right? Like loss, moving, friendships ending, sometimes even just like no obvious reason at all.
And I think that's an important thing to remember for anyone listening who's struggling with loneliness, that there's no one cause. Everyone's experience is unique. And sometimes it can be hard to pinpoint exactly why you're feeling lonely, and that's okay.
And one thing I really appreciate about this article is that it talks about the stigma that surrounds loneliness. It's like admitting you're lonely is admitting some sort of weakness, which is so not true.
Yeah, like you said, it's definitely not a weakness, but that stigma, that shame, it can prevent people from, reaching out for help. And that can make the loneliness even worse.
Exactly. So we've been talking about what loneliness is, some of the things that can cause it, but let's get to the good stuff. Let's talk about what we can actually do about it. And the first thing the article brings up is self-compassion.
Self-compassion is huge, EE. Especially when you're feeling lonely. Because when you're in that headspace, it's so easy to start beating yourself up. You think like, oh, there must be something wrong with me. Why else would I be alone? And that kind of thinking just makes everything worse.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Like you just start spiraling.
Right.
Yeah. And that inner voice gets so loud and it's just telling you all these negative things about yourself.
Right. Exactly. But self-compassion is like this antidote to that. It's about being kind to yourself, offering yourself the same understanding and support that you would offer a friend who is struggling.
So instead of judging yourself for feeling lonely, you basically, like, comfort yourself. It's almost like being your own best friend, you know?
Yes. And it sounds simple, but it can be really powerful. Dr. Kristen Neff, who's like the expert on self-compassion, she talks about these 3 key components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness.
Okay, break those down for us.
Self-kindness is basically, treating yourself with gentleness, understanding that you're going through a tough time. Common humanity is recognizing that, hey, loneliness is a normal human experience. You're not alone in this. Tons of people feel this way. And mindfulness is about just acknowledging your feelings without judgment, just letting them be there.
So you're not trying to push away the feeling of loneliness. You're just trying to change how you relate to it.
Yeah, exactly. You're not resisting it. You're not judging it. You're just being present with it.
And the article gives some practical tips for how to actually do this, like, for example, challenging negative self-talk.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. So, like, instead of thinking, I'm so pathetic for being alone, you might say something like, okay, I'm feeling lonely right now. That's understandable. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person or unlovable or anything like that.
And it also mentions writing a letter to yourself, like an actual letter, but a really supportive, compassionate one. Have you ever tried that?
I have, and it can be kind of weird at first, but it really does work because it forces you to, like, externalize those feelings, and then you can offer yourself comfort in a way that you might not have been able to do just thinking about it in your head.
I like that. Like, putting it down on paper makes it feel less overwhelming somehow. Okay, so we're being kinder to ourselves. What's the next step?
So once you started cultivating that self-compassion, the next thing to focus on is how you view solitude. Because when you're feeling lonely, it's natural to see any time you spend alone as like this negative thing.
Oh yeah, totally. It feels like evidence that you're, like, unwanted, right? Like, oh, no one wants to hang out with me, so here I am again, all alone.
Exactly. But the article suggests reframing solitude, seeing it as a chance for, self-discovery, as an opportunity to do things you enjoy without distractions. The article uses this really great metaphor. It calls solitude fertile ground, like a blank canvas.
I love that, like a blank canvas where you can create anything you want.
Right. So instead of dreading being alone, you can start to see it as this, like, gift of uninterrupted time. Time to explore those hobbies you've been putting off, to read those books that have been piling up, or to just, relax and recharge.
And it doesn't have to be anything super elaborate.
Yeah.
The article talks about starting small, like maybe just having a cup of tea and reading a few pages of a book.
Yeah, and the key is to make it a regular thing. Like, maybe you set aside 40 minutes every evening for some solo time. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. And eventually you might even start to look forward to it.
Okay, so we're being kinder to ourselves. We're reframing how we view solitude. What else can we do?
Another really important strategy the article talks about is cultivating a rich inner world. Because the thing is, when you're feeling lonely, your mind can become this, like, empty, echoing space. And that just amplifies the loneliness.
Yeah, and then you're just stuck with your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And if those thoughts are mainly negative, it can turn into this downward spiral.
Exactly. So what the article suggests is actively filling that inner space with things that bring you joy. Things that make you feel connected to something bigger than yourself, like books, music, movies, art, anything that stimulates your mind and your imagination.
The article actually mentions a couple of specific books, like The Night Circus for its, beautiful language and that feeling of escaping into another world, and then To Kill a Mockingbird for its powerful lessons about empathy.
And I love that they highlight those specific books because it's not just about, distracting yourself. It's about actively engaging with stories, with ideas, with experiences that can help you see the world in new ways, that can help you feel less alone.
And then there's journaling. The article talks about that quite a bit.
Yeah, journaling can be a great way to process your emotions, to get those feelings out of your head and onto the page. And they suggest using prompts to get started. Like, maybe you ask yourself, what am I missing most right now? Or what would I tell my younger self who might be feeling this way?
So you're basically like having a conversation with yourself, but in a way that allows you to be more compassionate, more understanding.
Exactly. And the article talks about how that inner world, the world of your thoughts and feelings, can become a sanctuary, a place where you can find comfort and solace, even when the outside world feels overwhelming.
Okay, so we're building this rich inner world, this sanctuary for ourselves. But eventually, we have to engage with the outside world again,
That
right?
too.
And that can be scary when you're feeling lonely.
Yeah, it can be super intimidating. Because when you're in that lonely headspace, the thought of reaching out to people, of putting yourself out there, can just feel like impossible. You feel like you're going to be rejected or that you're bothering people.
Oh, totally. And the article acknowledges that. It talks about how loneliness can lead to this inertia, like you just want to stay in your little bubble and not risk getting hurt.
But here's the thing, and this is what the article emphasizes. Connection doesn't just happen magically. You have to be proactive about it. You have to be willing to put yourself out there, even when it's uncomfortable.
And they suggest starting with small steps, like maybe just sending a text message to an old friend.
Yeah.
Just a quick, hey, thinking of you kind of thing.
Exactly. Or maybe you call a family member you haven't spoken to in a while. It doesn't have to be some big, elaborate thing, just a small gesture to let someone know you're thinking about them. And often, that's all it takes to open the door to a deeper conversation, to rekindle that connection.
And then, for building those deeper connections, the article talks about vulnerability, about being willing to share your feelings with people you trust, even if it feels a little scary.
Yeah, vulnerability is key to forming those strong, meaningful bonds. Because when you let your guard down and allow yourself to be seen, it gives other people permission to do the same. And that's how real intimacy is created.
So it's like, by being vulnerable, you're actually creating the space for others to be vulnerable with you. And that leads to real connection.
Exactly. And then, beyond reconnecting with people you already know, the article also suggests exploring new social avenues, like joining a book club, taking a class, volunteering.
I love that idea. It's like finding ways to meet people who share your interests, so the connection feels more organic, less forced.
Right, because you're already starting with something in common, and then as you get to know each other through that shared activity, those initial connections can grow into friendships.
Okay, so we're being kind to ourselves, we're reframing solitude, we're building a rich inner world, we're reaching out to others. And now the article gets into something that might seem a little basic, but it's actually super important: establishing a routine.
Yeah, routine is like this anchor, especially when you're feeling lonely, because it can be so easy to just let your days kind of drift by aimlessly. And that lack of structure can actually make the loneliness feel even worse.
It's like you're just floating through time and there's no sense of purpose or direction.
Exactly. So the article suggests starting with the basics, like making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy meals at regular times, and getting some exercise. These might seem small, but they make a huge difference in terms of how you feel both physically and emotionally.
It's like you're taking care of yourself, which sends a message to your brain that you're worthy of care.
Right. And then on top of that, you can start layering in other activities that you enjoy, like maybe you have a morning routine where you make yourself a nice cup of coffee and listen to your favorite podcast, or maybe you do some yoga in the evening.
It's about creating a structure for your day, giving it some rhythm.
Exactly. And even if those activities are things you do by yourself, the routine itself can be really grounding and help you feel less lost and adrift.
Okay, so we've got self-care, we've got routine. What about spending time in nature? The article talks about that quite a bit.
Oh yeah, nature is amazing for combating loneliness. I mean, have you ever noticed how even just taking a short walk in the park can totally shift your mood?
For sure, it's like all the stress just melts away and you feel more connected to, everything.
Exactly. The article talks about how those sensory experiences, the sound of birds singing, the feeling of the sun on your skin, the smell of fresh air, all those things can be so grounding and remind us that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
It's like it pulls you out of your head and back into the present moment,
Yeah, totally. And it doesn't have to be a big production. It could be as simple as sitting on a park bench for a few minutes, or even just having a plant on your desk that you tend to. The point is to make a conscious effort to engage with the natural world however you can.
And the article suggests even bringing a notebook with you when you go out into nature and writing down your observations. I like that idea.
Yeah, me too. It makes it more mindful, You're actively noticing the beauty around you.
Okay, so we're connecting with nature, we're building routines, we're being kind to ourselves. What else can we do to shift out of that lonely feeling?
One really powerful tool is gratitude. Because when you're feeling lonely, it's so easy to get fixated on what's missing in your life. right? Like you're hyper-focused on the lack of connection, the lack of love, the lack of whatever it is you're yearning for.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. You just get stuck in that loop of, I don't have this, I don't have that.
Exactly. But gratitude is like a spotlight that you can shine on all the good things that are present in your life. And it doesn't have to be huge things. It could be as simple as, having a roof over your head or a warm bed to sleep in or a good cup of coffee in the morning.
And the article recommends actually making a list every day of things you're grateful for.
Yeah, and the key is to make it a regular practice. Even just writing down 3 things each day can make a huge difference. Because what you're doing is you're retraining your brain to focus on the positive, to see the good that's already there.
So it's not about denying the loneliness. It's about counteracting it with this sense of appreciation for what you do have.
Exactly. It's about creating a more balanced perspective.
And speaking of balance, we can't talk about loneliness without talking about technology, right? Because on the one hand, it's this amazing tool for connecting with people, but on the other hand, it can actually make loneliness worse.
Oh, absolutely. Especially social media.
Yeah.
Because you're constantly being bombarded with these curated versions of people's lives. And it's so easy to start comparing yourself, feeling like you're not good enough, not successful enough, not happy enough. And that can lead to this feeling of isolation, of being disconnected from the real world.
Yeah, it's like you're constantly reminded of what you're supposedly lacking.
Right. So the article suggests being more mindful of your technology use, like setting limits on your screen time, unfollowing accounts that make you feel bad, prioritizing real-life interactions over online ones whenever possible.
It's about making sure technology is working for you, not against you.
Exactly. And you can also use technology in positive ways, like joining online communities based on your interests. But even then, it's important to remember that those online connections should ideally complement, not replace, your real-life relationships.
Okay, so we're being mindful of our tech use. What happens when those feelings of loneliness just become too much to handle?
Well, the article makes a really important point, which is that it's okay to ask for help. If you're feeling overwhelmed, if the loneliness is persistent and starting to affect your everyday life, reaching out to a therapist or joining a support group is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. It's like if you had a physical health problem that you couldn't solve on your own, you would go to a doctor. So why not do the same for your mental health?
Right. And there are so many resources available now, like online therapy platforms, support groups, even just hotlines you can call to talk to someone. You don't have to go through this alone.
And another really interesting tip the article mentions is channeling your feelings into something creative, like painting, writing, music, anything that allows you to express yourself.
Yeah, I love that one, because it's like you're taking that loneliness, all that raw emotion, and transforming it into something beautiful, something meaningful.
It's almost like you're taking back control, Instead of letting the loneliness consume you, you're using it as fuel for something positive.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not about creating a masterpiece. It's about the process itself, about letting those feelings flow through you and out into the world in a healthy way.
And then another way to shift your focus outward is through volunteering, which the article also highlights.
Volunteering is amazing for combating loneliness. Because when you're focused on helping others, it takes you out of your own head, and it connects you to something bigger than yourself.
Plus, you meet other people who are also passionate about the same cause. So again, it's a natural way to form connections.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment. Even just an hour a week can make a big difference.
Now, the article also talks about something that's a little more unconventional, but can be really helpful for some people: getting a pet.
Oh yeah, pets are the best. They offer this unconditional love and companionship, and they force you to get out of your own head and focus on something else.
And even just the routine of taking care of a pet, like feeding them, walking them, playing with them, can be really grounding when you're feeling lost and adrift.
Totally. And the article suggests, if you're not able to adopt a pet, maybe consider fostering one, or even just volunteering at an animal shelter. Just being around animals can be therapeutic.
Yeah, it's hard to feel lonely when you have a furry friend cuddling up to you, right?
Right. And it can really make a big difference in your overall well-being.
Now, one other thing I thought was really interesting in the article is the idea of revisiting positive memories. Because when you're in the thick of loneliness, it can be hard to remember that you've ever felt truly connected.
Yes, it can feel like you've always been alone, but that's not true, right? We all have those memories of times when we felt loved, supported, connected, and actively bringing those memories to mind can be really helpful.
So like looking at old photos, reading old letters, anything that evokes those positive feelings.
Exactly, because what you're doing is you're reminding yourself that connection is possible, that you are capable of experiencing it.
It's like proof that you're not doomed to be alone forever.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, the article talks about mindfulness.
Oh yeah, mindfulness. That seems to be the answer to everything these days.
Right. But for good reason. Because mindfulness can be so helpful for dealing with difficult emotions, including loneliness. It's basically about learning to be present in the moment, without judgment, and it can help quiet that negative self-talk that can be so loud when you're feeling isolated.
So instead of getting swept away by your thoughts and feelings, you're just observing them.
Right, and that can be really powerful because it gives you a little bit of distance from those thoughts. It allows you to see them as just thoughts, not necessarily truths.
And the article mentions that there are all sorts of resources available now for learning mindfulness, like apps and online courses.
Yeah, and even just starting with 5 minutes a day can make a difference. It's like anything else, the more you practice, the easier it gets, and the more benefit you'll get from it.
Okay, so we're practicing mindfulness, we're revisiting happy memories, we're being kind to ourselves, we're reaching out. But what about the future? Because loneliness can really make it feel like things will never get better.
Yeah, it can trap you in this feeling of hopelessness. That's why it's so important to actively cultivate hope for the future, even if it's just small things like planning a trip, signing up for a class, or starting a new project.
It's about having something to look forward to.
Exactly. It doesn't even have to be something that involves other people. It could be a personal goal, anything that gives you a sense of purpose and direction.
And one thing I really appreciate about this article is that it doesn't pretend there's some magic solution to loneliness, you know?
Yeah, it acknowledges that everyone's experience is unique, and what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works for you and not being afraid to experiment, to try different things.
And the article also highlights that progress isn't always linear. There are going to be good days and bad days, and that's totally normal.
It's like a journey, right? With twists and turns and ups and downs.
And even on those tough days, it's important to celebrate the small victories, you know? Like maybe you managed to reach out to one friend, or you spent 10 minutes practicing mindfulness. Those small steps can make a big difference over time.
And the article ends with this really lovely anecdote about a woman named Clara. She found herself alone after a divorce, and she was feeling incredibly lonely. But she started incorporating all these different strategies we've been talking about: self-compassion, spending time in nature, joining a pottery class. And over time, those feelings of loneliness started to lift.
It's a great example of how, even in the face of really challenging circumstances, it is possible to find your way back to connection, to joy, to a sense of belonging.
So I guess the takeaway here is that as hard as it is, loneliness can actually be a really powerful teacher, you know?
It can show us what truly matters in life, what we really value, and what we need to feel connected and fulfilled.
And it can make us more compassionate, both towards ourselves and towards others.
And it can help us appreciate those moments of connection even more, you know? Those moments when we feel truly seen, truly heard, truly understood.
Because ultimately, we're all in this together, right?
Yeah.
We're all connected in ways we might not even realize. And knowing that can make a huge difference when you're feeling alone. So for anyone listening who might be struggling with loneliness, know that you're not alone. And there is hope. And there are things you can do to feel better.
Yeah, and we hope that this deep dive has given you some ideas, some tools, some inspiration to start navigating those feelings in a healthier way.
So for our listeners, what's one thing you can do today, right now, to nurture that feeling of connection? Maybe it's reaching out to a friend, or taking a walk in nature, or simply taking a few deep breaths and offering yourself a moment of kindness. Whatever it is, take that step. Because you deserve to feel connected. You deserve to feel loved. And you deserve to feel whole.
And sometimes taking that first step, however small it might seem, is all it takes to start moving in the right direction.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next time.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to a deep dive into something I think we all need a better grasp on: boundaries.
Oh, for sure.
Today's source is an article called "The Importance of Setting Boundaries." And honestly, the timing couldn't be better.
Definitely.
Feeling overstretched, like you're constantly giving but not receiving.
It's so common.
We're about to break down why boundaries are so essential, especially in this crazy, hyper-connected world.
It's so crucial.
Get ready to walk away with a framework for setting those lines in every aspect of your life. From your love life to, yes, even your relationship with your smartphone.
I love it.
I love it too.
It's fascinating how often we mistake busyness for productivity, connection for fulfillment.
Right.
This deep dive will help you see how boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're the key to showing up more fully as yourself.
All right, so let's dive right in.
Okay.
First things first, how does this article actually define what a boundary is? Because it's not like building a wall, right?
Right. The article uses this brilliant analogy. Boundaries are like property lines. Okay.
They mark what's me and what's not me. Without them, it's easy to lose sight of where you end and other people's demands begin.
Okay, property lines, I get it.
Yeah.
But why is this distinction so important for us, practically speaking? Why should someone listening care about this whole boundary thing?
Because without those lines, you end up living in a constant state of reaction, responding to everyone else's needs but neglecting your own. Over time, this leads to resentment, exhaustion, and feeling like you've lost your sense of self.
And that's where the link to mental health comes in, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard about this, but the article goes deeper, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's not just about feeling less stress.
Right.
A 2019 study in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology found that people who struggled to set work-life boundaries experienced much higher anxiety.
Wow.
On the flip side, those who did set boundaries, like not checking work emails after hours, reported significantly lower anxiety and were more satisfied with their jobs.
See, that's what I love about this deep dive.
It's not just saying boundaries are good, it's like,
Right.
here's the proof.
The data's there.
So how do boundaries actually help with those feelings of overwhelm, like on an emotional level?
Boundaries act as a buffer, preventing you from absorbing other people's negativity.
Okay.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
If you're constantly letting others cross your lines, you're essentially letting their emotional baggage pile up in your own space.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right.
It's like that feeling you get after hanging out with someone who's always complaining. You walk away feeling drained yourself.
Exactly. Boundaries, especially for those who are naturally empathetic, are about creating a safe space to process your own emotions without being bombarded by everyone else's.
So how does this all play out in the context of actual relationships? Because boundaries seem super important for our individual well-being, but relationships are all about connecting with others, right?
That's where it gets interesting. The article argues that healthy relationships actually require clear boundaries. They're not about creating distance. They're about establishing mutual respect.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break it down.
Yeah.
How would this work in a romantic relationship, for example?
Think about those early stages of a relationship, the honeymoon phase.
Yeah.
It's natural to want to spend all your time together, merge your lives completely.
Well, I've been there. That initial intensity is intoxicating.
Yeah.
But is the article saying we should resist that urge?
Not necessarily resist, but be mindful.
Okay.
A 2021 study in the Journal of Family Psychology found that couples who maintained some individual interests and friendships actually reported higher levels of trust and intimacy in the long run.
Wait, really? That seems counterintuitive.
Right.
Yeah.
But the research suggests that when both partners have their own space to recharge and pursue their passions, they bring a more whole and interesting version of themselves to the relationship.
Right.
It avoids that feeling of being suffocated or losing your identity.
So boundaries are actually a key ingredient for keeping that spark alive. It's not about pulling away. It's about showing up as your best self.
Exactly. And this applies to family relationships as well.
Okay.
It's about respecting each other's autonomy, even if that means saying no sometimes.
Well, that's a tough one, especially when it comes to family.
It can be.
Like, how do you set those boundaries with, say, overbearing parents who are used to having a certain level of control?
It's about starting small and being consistent.
Okay.
The article suggests practicing clear but compassionate communication. I appreciate your concern, but this is something I need to figure out on my own.
So it's about standing your ground respectfully.
Yeah.
But what about friendships? Where do boundaries fit into those dynamics?
Friendships thrive on balance.
Okay.
We all have that friend who's a great listener, but if it's always one-sided, resentment can build.
Yeah.
Setting a boundary might mean saying, hey, I'm here for you, but I also need to talk about what's going on with me.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not about shutting them down. It's about ensuring the friendship is mutually supportive.
Exactly.
All right. So far, we've been talking about boundaries in a pretty general sense.
Right.
But this all gets way more complex when we consider cultural differences, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
How we express and perceive boundaries varies widely across cultures. For instance, in individualistic cultures like the US,
Right.
asserting personal boundaries is seen as a sign of strength,
Right.
while in more collectivist cultures, it might be perceived as selfish or disrespectful.
That's a huge factor, especially in our globalized world.
It is.
Imagine the challenges someone faces when they move from a collectivist culture to a more individualistic one.
Exactly. The article gives the example of a second-generation Asian American trying to decline a family obligation.
Okay.
What's considered perfectly acceptable in American culture might be seen as a major transgression within their family's traditions.
So how do we navigate those differences? Are there any universal principles when it comes to boundaries, or is it all relative?
That's a great question. While the specific ways we express boundaries might differ, the underlying principle of respecting ourselves and others remains constant.
Okay.
It's about finding a way to honor both your own needs and the cultural context you're in.
That requires a lot of self-awareness and sensitivity.
Yeah.
And speaking of navigating different worlds,
Right.
we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the digital age.
It's everywhere.
I mean, how do we even begin to set boundaries with our phones and all this tech constantly vying for our attention?
It's a jungle out there, digitally speaking. But the good news is the same principles we've been talking about apply here too.
Oh.
It's all about conscious choices.
Okay, but that's easy to say.
Right.
I feel like my phone is an extension of my hand at this point.
Yeah.
How do we actually start setting those digital boundaries? Where do we even draw the line?
The article suggests a two-pronged approach.
Okay.
External boundaries and internal boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
External boundaries are about setting up literal barriers like turning off notifications, creating phone-free zones.
Or scheduling specific times to check email.
So it's like creating a little breathing room for yourself, a space where you're not constantly bombarded by digital demands.
Exactly.
I like it. But what about the internal boundaries? What are those all about?
Internal boundaries are about managing your own mindset and reactions.
Okay.
This is where mindfulness comes in.
Okay.
It's about noticing those urges to check your phone every 5 seconds.
Right.
And asking yourself, do I really need to look at this right now, or am I just avoiding something else?
Oh, that hits close to home.
Yeah.
I'm definitely guilty of using my phone as a distraction sometimes, especially when I'm feeling anxious or bored.
We all do it.
Yeah.
But the more we practice that self-awareness, the better we become at choosing how we spend our time and attention.
This makes me think about those studies that show how social media can negatively impact our self-esteem.
Oh, absolutely.
Is the article saying we should all just quit social media altogether?
It's not about quitting entirely, but being more discerning.
The article encourages what it calls a social media audit.
Okay.
Go through your feeds and unfollow any accounts that make you feel inadequate, envious, or trigger negative comparisons.
It's like decluttering your digital space.
Exactly.
Out with the negativity, in with the stuff that actually uplifts and inspires you.
That's it.
I can get behind that.
Yeah.
But what about the work-life balance struggle? That feels like a whole other beast, especially in the age of remote work and constant connectivity.
It's a huge challenge, but boundaries are essential here too.
Okay.
The article cites a 2022 Harvard Business Review report that found employees who set clear boundaries between work and personal time were more productive and less stressed.
Wait, more productive? That's interesting.
It is.
I always thought being always on meant getting more done.
It's actually the opposite.
Wow.
When you're constantly switching between tasks, checking emails at all hours, you're never fully focused on anything.
Right.
It's like trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. You'll get somewhere eventually, but it'll be a bumpy and exhausting ride.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
So what are some practical tips for setting those work-life boundaries, especially when the lines are so blurred these days?
The article recommends establishing clear work hours, even if you're working from home.
Okay.
Designate a specific workspace, if possible, so you can physically and mentally separate yourself from work when you're off the clock.
So it's about creating those rituals and routines that signal to your brain, okay, it's work time, and okay, it's time to relax and recharge.
That's right.
I can see how that would make a huge difference.
It does.
It's all about sending those signals to yourself and to others.
Right.
Let your colleagues know your availability.
Right.
And resist the urge to respond to emails or messages outside of work hours.
That's huge.
But what if your boss expects you to be available 24/7? That feels like a tough boundary to set.
It can be tricky, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
The key is to communicate your boundaries clearly and respectfully. For instance, you could say something like, I'm committed to my work and I'll always make sure things are covered. However, to maintain a healthy work-life balance, I need to disconnect after 7 p.m. I'll be sure to respond to any urgent messages first thing in the morning.
It's about being proactive and setting those expectations up front.
Definitely.
And if they push back, you can always reiterate your boundaries and remind them of the benefits: higher productivity, fewer burnout cases. Everyone wins.
Exactly. It's about framing it as a win-win situation.
Right.
You're not being difficult, you're simply setting yourself up for success.
Okay, so we've talked about boundaries at work, in our digital lives.
Right.
But what about those times when it feels like setting a boundary is just going to cause conflict or hurt someone's feelings?
Yeah.
Like, what if you have a friend who's going through a tough time and really needs to vent?
That's where it gets even trickier because we don't want to come across as cold or uncaring.
Right. It's like, how do you balance being a good friend with protecting your own emotional well-being? Because let's face it, sometimes those intense emotional dumps can leave you feeling drained and depleted.
The article offers some practical tips for navigating these situations.
Okay.
It emphasizes that compassion and boundaries aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay.
You can be supportive without becoming an emotional punching bag.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So what are some ways to set those boundaries without shutting your friend down completely?
First, try setting time limits for those conversations.
Okay.
You could say, I'm here for you and want to listen, but I only have about half an hour right now.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
It acknowledges their need without letting the conversation take over your entire evening.
Exactly.
Another strategy is to gently redirect the conversation towards solutions or resources.
That's right.
You could say, it sounds like you're going through a lot. Have you considered talking to a therapist? I'm happy to help you find someone.
That's a good one.
It's about offering support, but also recognizing that sometimes professional help is needed.
Exactly. And if those tactics don't work, you might need to have a more direct, heart-to-heart conversation.
Okay, that sounds terrifying.
It can be.
Any tips on how to approach those conversations without making things worse?
The article stresses the importance of using I statements to express your feelings and needs without blaming the other person.
Okay.
Instead of saying, you're always dumping your problems on me.
Right.
You could say, I care about you, but when we talk, it often ends up feeling heavy for me. I need us to find a better balance.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership of your experience and communicating it in a way that's honest, but not accusatory.
Right.
But what if they get defensive or react badly?
It's natural for people to get defensive when their behavior is challenged.
Right.
The key is to stay calm and reiterate your boundaries.
Right.
Remember, you're not trying to control their reaction. You're simply communicating your needs.
So it's almost like a test of the friendship in a way. If they can't respect your boundaries, it might be a sign that the relationship isn't as healthy as you thought.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Boundaries can actually be incredibly clarifying.
Right.
They help us see which relationships are truly reciprocal and supportive and which ones might need some reevaluating.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But before we go too deep into the relationship stuff, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier.
Okay.
That whole idea of boundaries being an act of self-love.
Oh, totally.
Can you unpack that a little more?
Absolutely. For many of us, especially women, we're conditioned to prioritize others' needs above our own.
Right.
We're taught to be nice, to be accommodating, to put everyone else first.
Yeah.
But setting boundaries is about saying, hey, my needs matter too.
Right.
It's about recognizing that you're worthy of respect, time, and energy, just like everyone else.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah,
It's not selfish to take care of yourself. It's actually essential.
exactly. And the more you practice setting boundaries, the more you'll realize that it's not about deprivation.
Right.
It's about creating a life that's truly fulfilling.
Right.
When you have clear boundaries, you have more energy and capacity to show up for the people and things that truly matter to you.
I'm starting to see how this all ties together.
Yeah.
Boundaries aren't just about saying no. They're about saying yes to yourself, to your well-being, to the life you want to create.
Precisely. It's about making conscious choices that align with your values and priorities.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership of your time, your energy, and your life.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
I feel like I have a whole new framework for thinking about boundaries and a toolbox of strategies to actually implement them in my own life.
I love that.
Yeah, me too. It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Absolutely.
I hope our listeners feel empowered to start setting those boundaries and creating a life that truly honors their needs and values.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought from the article.
Okay.
It says, setting boundaries is not a one-time event. It's a lifelong practice.
That's so important to remember. It's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
There will be times when you stumble, when you feel guilty, when you face resistance.
Sure.
But the more you practice, the easier it becomes.
So true.
Yeah?
And remember, even the smallest boundary can make a big difference.
For sure.
Start small, be consistent, and most importantly, be kind to yourself along the way.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that I think a lot of you have probably thought about. Maybe you've even used the words to describe yourselves or people you know. Introverts and extroverts.
Yeah, definitely familiar terms, but as with a lot of things we talk about here, I think there's always more to uncover.
Exactly. We're going to move way past those basic definitions and really get into the nitty-gritty, the nuances of what it means to be one or the other. Or, spoiler alert, maybe somewhere in between.
Right, because it's not just black and white, is it? Like human personality is so complex.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is we've got a bunch of super interesting material to draw on. We're using the English language itself to kind of guide us, to see how all these ideas about introversion and extroversion play out.
Love that approach. It's like language is a window into how we think about ourselves, right?
Yeah, I think so. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll not only have a much clearer idea of where you might fall on that introvert-extrovert spectrum, but you'll also understand why it matters. Like, how can this knowledge actually help you in your life?
Because self-awareness is powerful, right? And understanding others, just as crucial.
Totally. So shall we rewind a bit? Go back to the OG, the man who kind of kicked off all this talk about introversion and extroversion?
You're talking about Carl Jung, right? That was back in 1921. Pretty groundbreaking stuff for the time.
It really was. His book, Psychological Types, introduced these ideas of how our, quote, psychic energy flows, like how we direct our attention and focus. And he saw extroverts as folks who kind of turn their energy outward towards the external world.
Which makes sense if you look at the Latin roots of the word. Extra, outside, verter, to turn.
So extroverts outward turning.
Precisely. And then you have introverts, from intra, within. So their energy flows inward toward their own thoughts, feelings, that internal world. But, and this is a big but, Jung didn't see these as like strict, separate boxes you had to fit into.
More like a sliding scale.
Yeah, tendencies along a continuum. We all have a bit of both, to different degrees.
Right, and Jung's ideas, they kind of laid the groundwork for so much research and thinking that came after. We had Hans Eysenck connecting extroversion to, like, our nervous system, how easily our brains get stimulated.
Yeah, that was fascinating, the whole arousal theory thing. Like, some people need more external input to feel, fully engaged.
And then, of course, you can't talk about introversion and extroversion without mentioning the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI. I mean, that thing is everywhere.
It definitely took Jung's ideas and made them, more mainstream, more applicable in a bunch of different settings.
Right, from career counseling to team building, you name it.
Yeah.
But again, what we're trying to do here is go beyond those surface level understandings.
Dig deeper, unpack the complexity.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start with introversion. One of the big misconceptions right off the bat is that introverts are shy or antisocial.
Ugh, such a tired stereotype. And so not true for a lot of introverts.
Right. Like, the key thing is that introverts primarily gain energy from solitude and quiet. Social interaction, it can be fun, it can be enjoyable, but it's draining.
Yeah, it depletes their energy, whereas being alone or in small groups, it replenishes them.
It's all about how you manage your energy, how you recharge. Imagine, let's say, Sarah, she's a software developer, super sharp, loves her work, can spend hours focused on code, totally in the zone.
Yeah, I can picture her like she's got her headphones on, noise canceling, of course, in flow state.
Exactly. Now, Sarah might have friends, enjoy going out sometimes, but at a big party, you probably won't find her as the center of attention. Maybe off to the side, having a deeper conversation with one or two people.
And then after a while, she needs a break, not because she dislikes the people, but because that social energy, it's running low.
She needs to step away, find a quiet corner, recharge her batteries. That's not being antisocial, that's self-care for an introvert.
Absolutely. It's like recognizing your limits and honoring your needs.
So it's not that introverts are antisocial, it's that their social energy is a limited resource.
Right, and they got to use it wisely. And there's actually some brain science that backs this up. Studies have shown introverts tend to have higher baseline activity in their cortex, the outer layer of the brain.
Oh, interesting. So like their brains are already kind of buzzing with activity even at rest.
Exactly. They don't need as much external stimulation to feel engaged. In fact, too much can be overwhelming, kind of like sensory overload.
Ah, that makes sense.
And even the way introverts use language can be different. They often choose words carefully, prioritize precision, think things through before speaking.
Less is more kind of thing.
Sometimes, yeah. And when they do speak, their contributions can be really insightful. They've really pondered things.
Okay, so if we're looking for like common introvert traits, we've got the preference for solitary activities, reading, writing, maybe making art.
Definitely. And they tend to be good listeners, thoughtful, not always jumping in to fill the silence.
Yeah, and that whole discomfort with small talk, I've heard that a lot. Introverts crave deeper conversations, more meaningful connection.
Totally. And after those social events, they need that downtime to recover. It's not a personal failing, it's just their wiring.
But, and this is important, not all introverts are exactly alike.
Right. Of course not. Some introverts can be amazing public speakers. Some might even thrive in certain collaborative settings. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
The key seems to be having a sense of control over the pace and intensity of interactions.
Exactly. Being able to step back when needed, set those boundaries.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the flip side, the outward dance of extroversion.
Yeah. Extroverts, they get their energy from being out in the world, connecting with people, experiencing new things.
They're energized by that external stimulation, right? Where Sarah might feel drained by a big party. James, let's say he's a sales manager, he'd be thriving in that environment.
Working the room, striking up conversations with everyone. For him, that's energizing.
Exactly. Imagine James at a networking event. He walks in, doesn't know anyone, but within minutes he's chatting, laughing, making connections. He genuinely enjoys that.
And afterwards, while Sarah might want to curl up with a book, James might hit up a bar with some new contacts. He needs that social buzz to keep going.
It's like solitude for him is draining, whereas for Sarah, it's essential.
Totally different ways of recharging those batteries. And again, there's some brain science to explain this. Extroverts, they tend to have lower baseline cortical arousal, so they need more external stimulation to reach their optimal level.
Okay, so their brains are kind of wired to seek out that stimulation, that novelty, that social reward.
Exactly. And their language often reflects that too. Extroverts, they tend to speak with more enthusiasm, use more expressive gestures.
They might think out loud, be more spontaneous with their words.
And they love telling stories, sharing their experiences. It's how they process things, by talking it out.
So if we were to list some hallmark extrovert traits, we'd have the love of social gatherings, group projects, any kind of high energy environment.
Right. And they're generally comfortable speaking up, taking risks, thinking on their feet. That discomfort with prolonged solitude is a big one too.
They need that interaction, that back and forth. But again, just like with introverts, not all extroverts are the same.
Definitely not. Some might be more drawn to leadership roles, others might be the life of the party. There's a spectrum within extroversion too.
The common thread seems to be that outward focus, that energy directed towards the external world.
But as we hinted at earlier, a lot of folks don't fit perfectly into either of these categories, right?
Right. Which brings us to the ambivert.
The folks who kind of straddle the line, blend those introverted and extroverted tendencies.
The chameleons of the personality world, adapting to different situations.
Exactly. Think of like Maya, she's a teacher. In the classroom, she's all energy, engaging the students, feeding off their enthusiasm. That's her extroverted side shining.
But then, when she's grading papers at night, she enjoys that quiet, focused time alone. That's her introverted side.
And research suggests this kind of flexibility can be a real asset, especially in certain professions.
Like sales, for instance. You got to be able to connect with people, but also listen carefully, adapt your approach.
And in ambiverts language, it would naturally reflect the duality too. They can be super expressive in a group, then more thoughtful one-on-one.
It really highlights that we're not talking about rigid categories, but rather points along a spectrum.
A spectrum with a lot of variation and nuance.
Speaking of nuance, let's address some of those pesky misconceptions and stereotypes that often get attached to introverts and extroverts.
Yeah, because unfortunately, there are a lot of them floating around.
Like for introverts, the whole antisocial hermit thing, it's just not accurate for many.
Right. It ignores the fact that introverts can have deep and meaningful relationships. They just might not need as much constant social interaction as an extrovert.
It's also important to distinguish between introversion and shyness. Shyness is about fear of social judgment, whereas introversion is about where you get your energy.
Exactly. And then for extroverts, there's this stereotype that they're shallow or attention-seeking, which again is a huge oversimplification.
It's like many extroverts are incredibly thoughtful and caring. They just express themselves differently, thrive in different environments.
And sometimes even the language we use can perpetuate these stereotypes.
Like saying someone needs to come out of their shell implies that introversion is something to be fixed.
Or the constant pressure to be the life of the party. It's like, why can't we appreciate different ways of being?
Absolutely. And it's worth mentioning Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which really brought attention to this kind of cultural bias towards extroversion.
Such an important book. It made a strong case for the power and value of introverts, especially in a world that often prizes loudness over thoughtfulness.
The bottom line is, neither introversion nor extroversion is inherently better. They each have their strengths.
And understanding those differences, it's not about labeling people, it's about appreciating the diversity of human personality.
Okay, so let's dive into the science for a bit. What's actually happening in our brains that might explain these different tendencies?
Well, brain imaging studies have shown some pretty interesting differences. Introverts, for example, tend to have more activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area associated with planning, problem solving, internal processing.
So like their brains are wired for more reflection, more internal deliberation.
That's one way to put it. And this might explain why introverts often like to think things through before speaking or acting.
Whereas extroverts, they seem to have a more active reward system in the brain, particularly the dopamine pathways.
Right. Dopamine is that neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. So for extroverts, that social interaction, that novelty, it actually triggers a stronger dopamine response.
Like their brains are getting more of a positive hit from those experiences.
Exactly. And it's not just the brain. Genetics play a role too. Twin studies suggest that extroversion can be quite heritable, maybe 40 to 60%.
So we're like predisposed to a certain degree, but our environment also shapes us.
Of course. If you grow up in a super social, outgoing family, you might be more likely to develop extroverted tendencies, and vice versa.
And even the way we talk can reflect those influences, right?
Right.
An introvert might say, I need to think it over, while an extrovert might be all, let's just do it.
That's a perfect example. It's like those ingrained patterns of thinking and behaving.
So how do these differences actually play out in our daily lives? For introverts, navigating a world that often seems built for extroverts, it can be tough.
Absolutely. Open plan offices, the constant pressure to be connected, to be available, it can be incredibly draining for introverts.
So what can they do?
Setting boundaries is crucial. Making sure they schedule downtime for themselves, finding roles that allow for focused work, independent contribution, those things are key.
And for extroverts, what kinds of challenges might they face?
Well, if they're in an environment that's too isolating, too quiet, too predictable, they can get restless. They might struggle with tasks that require a lot of solo work.
They need that buzz, that interaction.
Right. And in relationships, whether it's romantic or friendship, understanding these energy differences is so important.
Like back to Sarah and James. If he's always wanting to go out and she's constantly feeling overwhelmed by social situations, that's going to cause friction.
Yeah, and that's where communication comes in. Being able to articulate your needs, finding compromises.
Like maybe James suggests a movie night at home instead of a crowded bar, and Sarah agrees to go to a smaller gathering with friends occasionally.
Exactly, and using clear language to express how you're feeling, like, I'm really tapped out tonight, I need some quiet time, or I'm feeling a bit lonely, want to grab coffee.
It's about respecting those differences and finding ways to make it work for both people.
And it's interesting to think about how different cultures view introversion and extroversion. In some cultures, being more reserved is seen as a positive trait.
Yeah, like in Japan, where there's a strong emphasis on harmony and group cohesion.
Right. Whereas in the US, there's often more value placed on being assertive, outgoing, the kind of classic extrovert traits.
And historically, you can see these different archetypes too. You've got Lincoln, who is known for his introspection and quiet contemplation. And then you have Churchill, bold and charismatic.
And in literature, so many examples. Jane Austen's quiet heroines versus Shakespeare's boisterous characters. The language they use reflects those inner and outer worlds.
It's amazing how rich the English language is for describing these nuances. From reticent to ebullient, we've got words for all those subtle shades of personality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the main thing I hope people take away is that understanding introversion and extroversion is about empathy.
It's not about judging or labeling. It's about appreciating the beautiful diversity of human nature.
And for ourselves, knowing where we fall on the spectrum, it can help us make choices that support our well-being.
Setting healthy boundaries, finding work that energizes us, building relationships that honor our needs.
Absolutely. It's about understanding ourselves and others a little bit better.
And on that note, here's a final thought to ponder. How is the rise of online communication, all the social media, the virtual hangouts, how is that changing things?
Oh, that's a good one. Is it blurring the lines between introversion and extroversion?
Maybe. Or is it creating entirely new ways of connecting, new challenges, new possibilities?
That's something to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time. Hey, everyone. Welcome to your deep dive today. And we are going deep on something that I think is on everybody's mind pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
Even if we don't always think about it from a scientific perspective. And that is happiness.
Of course.
You know, the word, you've probably felt it, but have you ever really thought about like what is going on sort of under the hood to make that happen? We've got a really cool article to dig into today.
Yeah.
That's going to help us understand the science of happiness.
Yeah.
And it's written specifically to be accessible if you're learning English.
That's awesome.
So we're going to go way beyond just like a dictionary definition here. We're going to really unpack what happiness means by looking at the science behind it all.
I love it. So
let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into it. So, you know, the article starts off pretty simple, just saying happiness is a feeling of joy or peace or satisfaction.
Okay.
But then it makes this really helpful distinction between short-term and long-term happiness.
I see.
You know, think about like when you take that first bite of cake.
Oh, yeah.
Like pure joy, right? I'm happy because I ate cake.
Yeah, I'm happy I ate cake.
But that doesn't usually last all day.
Right.
Compare that to, let's say, the happiness that you get from having a good family.
Yeah.
That tends to be something that's a bit more lasting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like a difference between a sugar rush and then like a deep sense of contentment.
Yeah.
And you know what? For those of you learning English, the article actually gives you a little English lesson.
Nice.
By breaking down these words. You know, happiness is the noun, happy is the adjective, like a happy person, and happily is the adverb.
Okay.
So it would be like, she smiled happily.
Right.
And then give the example sentence, she smiled happily because she felt happiness.
I love that.
So you can really see how those words all work together.
Yeah, and how they're all related. So, you know, at this point, you might be thinking, all right, happiness, it feels good, so what?
Yeah.
Like, why do scientists even care to study this?
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a fair question. But the article points out that there's actually some really important reasons why scientists are interested in happiness.
Okay.
And it all comes down to the impact that happiness has on things like our physical health, how we do at work,
Sure.
and the quality of our relationships.
Okay.
It's not just like a nice side effect of a good life.
Yeah.
It's actually that feeling happiness more often
Yeah.
can lead to a longer life,
Oh.
can make you more productive at work, and can really strengthen your bonds with other people.
So it's actually a key ingredient in a lot of areas of life.
Yeah, and this is why the scientists are interested,
Okay, cool.
because they're trying to understand how it all works.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the science, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's talk about the brain, because I always find this so fascinating.
Yeah.
The article calls it like the control center for how we feel. And then it really focuses in on 4 key brain chemicals
Okay.
that are super important to happiness.
Right.
So the first one is dopamine,
Okay.
which they call the reward chemical.
Right. Dopamine.
So think about it like a little ding that goes off in your brain when you do something enjoyable or when you achieve a goal. It's that sense of, hey, that felt good. I want to do that again.
Yeah.
The example they give in the article is like winning a race.
Right.
That immediate sense of accomplishment.
Exactly. Like, yes, I did it.
Yeah.
For pronunciation, it's dopamine.
Perfect. Dopamine. Okay, so next we've got serotonin.
Okay.
And this one is all about feeling calm and confident.
Oh, nice.
When our serotonin levels are good,
Yeah.
we tend to have a more positive self-image and just feel better in general.
Yeah, like more balanced and stable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they say that things like spending time with friends can really boost your serotonin levels.
Or it's nice.
And that contributes to that feeling of stability
Yeah, for sure.
and peace.
And the pronunciation on that one is serotonin.
Serotonin. All right.
Yeah, tonin.
Is that it? And then there's oxytocin.
Oh, yeah.
And this one I always think of as the warm, fuzzy one.
Yeah.
It's often called the love chemical because it's really tied to feelings of connection and affection.
Yeah, it gets released when we're physically close to someone or when we feel like a real bond with somebody.
The example they give in the article is that feeling you get when you hug your mom.
Oh.
Like that feeling of...
Yeah, just like closeness, and that's oxytocin.
Oxytocin.
Yeah,
and then last, but certainly not least, we have endorphins.
Oh, yeah.
These are the body's natural painkillers,
Yes.
but they also make us feel strong and good.
Right, like that runner's high kind of feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article says these get released when we exercise or even when we laugh, like a really good belly laugh.
So laughing is good for us.
Yeah, laughing is good for you.
That's good to know.
I love that.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Endorphins.
Endorphin.
So, it's really the interplay of all of these chemicals that contributes to our happiness.
Yeah.
If one of them is out of whack, it can throw the whole thing off.
Yeah.
It's like,
Like ingredients in a recipe?
Yeah, like ingredients or like members of a band. If one of them's not playing in tune or if they're like too loud,
Yeah.
the whole band doesn't sound right.
The whole performance suffers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the chemicals in our brains. But now let's look at what the research tells us about what actually makes people happy in their day-to-day lives.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to know.
All right. So the first one, and this probably won't come as a huge surprise to anyone,
Okay.
is relationships. So many studies have shown that strong social connections, whether it's with family, friends, or even just being part of your community, are like fundamental to happiness.
Yeah, makes sense.
And the article point out that it's because these positive relationships trigger those chemicals we were just talking about, like oxytocin and serotonin.
Yeah.
And that strengthens those bonds even more, and it just contributes to our well-being in general.
So it's a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And the article asks a really good question here. It says, who makes you happy?
That is a good question.
It's something to think about.
Yeah.
All right, so the next factor is money.
Okay.
And this one always has a bit of a twist.
All right.
So research shows that having enough money to feel comfortable definitely increases happiness.
Yeah. I mean, that's understandable.
Right? Like you're not stressed about paying your bills.
Got that sense of security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and this is the interesting part, beyond a certain point, making more money doesn't really make you that much happier.
Oh, interesting.
They call this the happiness plateau.
Okay.
So it's like...
So you reach a certain level and then it kind of levels off?
It levels off.
Okay.
Yeah, and they think this might be because, as humans, we kind of get used to whatever situation we're in. They call that hedonic adaptation.
Right.
Or it could be that the things that make us truly happy in the long term, like relationships and purpose, aren't really about having a lot of money.
Right. It's not about the stuff you can buy.
Yeah.
It's about something more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article actually defines that word plateau
Okay.
as a level where things stay pretty constant.
Right.
And they give an example. It says that, for some people, once they're making around $50,000 a year,
Okay.
that's where the plateau starts. But of course, that's going to vary a lot.
Yeah.
Depending on where you live in your own personal situation.
Makes sense.
All right. The next one on the list is health.
Oh, yeah.
And this one, again, probably makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
When you're feeling good physically, it really does have a positive impact on your mental and emotional state.
Yeah, when your body feels good, your mind feels good.
Exactly. For sure. Yeah. So the article points out things like regular exercise, getting enough sleep,
right,
and eating nutritious food.
Yeah, healthy stuff.
Yeah. All of these things contribute to boosting those happiness chemicals.
Okay.
Like endorphins and serotonin. You even give an example, like feeling happier after you've gotten a full 8 hours of sleep.
Oh, that's relatable.
Totally. All right. What's next?
So what else makes us happy?
Okay. So then there's this idea of purpose. And the article talks about how having meaningful goals in life, whether that's through your job, a hobby that you're passionate about, or even just helping other people.
Yeah.
All of this really contributes to a deeper sense of happiness. It's about feeling like you have a direction.
Right. Like you're making a difference.
Yeah. And the article defines purpose as a reason for doing something.
Okay.
And gives the example of teaching English,
Oh, nice.
which I think is a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like you're helping people to communicate.
Yeah, and you're contributing to their lives.
Yeah, you're contributing to the world.
Exactly.
Ah.
So now we've talked about relationships, money,
Mm-hmm.
health, and purpose.
Yeah.
But it's not all about these big life-altering things.
Okay.
The article also makes a point of talking about small joys.
Yeah.
And these are like those everyday pleasures that even though they might seem little,
Yeah.
they can really add up over time
Right.
to make you feel happier overall.
It's like little moments of delight throughout the day.
Yes.
Yeah.
So think about things like enjoying a cup of coffee in the morning,
Oh, yeah.
or just taking a moment to appreciate a beautiful sunset.
Mm-hmm.
Those are small joys.
Those are good ones.
And the article gives the example of like drinking tea
Oh, nice.
and just like the comfort that can bring.
Yeah.
So it's about being mindful of those little things throughout the day.
Yeah.
So this next part I found super interesting.
Okay.
Some scientists have actually tried to come up with a happiness formula.
Oh, wow. Like a mathematical.
Yeah, like a mathematical equation.
Okay.
And one of the models that they mentioned in the article
Okay.
breaks it down into percentages like this.
All right.
50% is your genes,
Okay.
40% is your intentional actions,
Mm-hmm.
and only 10% is life circumstances or events.
Oh, wow. So our genes play a big role.
It seems like it.
Okay.
Yeah, so 50% is like your baseline predisposition to a certain level of happiness that you inherit.
Okay.
But what's really empowering about this
Yeah.
is that 40%, that's based on the choices you make.
So we have a lot of control.
Yeah, things like exercise,
Mm-hmm.
practicing gratitude,
Right.
taking care of your relationships.
Those are all things that we can actively do.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that 10% for life events
Yeah.
acknowledges that, yeah, stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's outside of your control.
Right.
But the majority of your happiness
Yeah.
seems to be within your control.
Wow. That's really empowering.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That-
it's not just fate.
It's not just fate.
Okay.
All right, so speaking of things that are within our control, let's get to the practical tips.
Yes, please.
The article gives us 5 actionable things that we can all try to do
Okay.
to boost our happiness levels.
I'm ready.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, number 1, move your body. Exercise is so good for releasing those endorphins. And the tip here is to aim for about 20 minutes most days of the week
Okay.
of some kind of physical activity.
So that could be anything, right?
It could be anything. You could go for a walk. You could dance to your favorite music.
Yeah.
You could play a sport.
I like it.
And the example they give in the article is, I danced yesterday and I felt so happy.
Nice.
I love that.
Yeah. Simple but powerful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
find something you enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, number 2, say thank you.
Oh, that's a good one.
This is all about cultivating gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently it helps to increase your serotonin levels.
Okay.
So the suggestion here is to make a habit of writing down 3 things every day
3 things you're grateful for.
that you're grateful for.
Okay.
And their example is, I'm thankful for my family, my home, and my food.
Yeah. Basic things that we often take for granted.
Yes,
Yeah.
but so important.
Mm-hmm.
All right, tip number 3, spend time with people.
Oh, yeah.
So we're back to the power of those positive relationships.
Mhm.
They boost your oxytocin.
Right.
So the tip is to make an effort to connect with people,
Yeah.
whether that's calling a friend on the phone
Mhm.
or making time for a family dinner,
Right. Quality time.
quality time. And the example is, talking to my sister makes me smile.
Yeah, that's sweet.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, tip number 4, help someone else.
Oh, I like that one.
This is all about kindness and generosity. And
Mhm.
apparently these acts actually raise your dopamine levels.
So it's good for us to be kind.
It's good for us to be kind.
That's nice.
And the suggestions are things like giving someone a compliment
Mhm.
or helping a neighbor with something.
Right. Just a little thing.
Little things, yeah. And the example they give is, I helped my friend with homework and it felt good.
Yeah. There you go.
And last but not least, tip number 5,
Okay.
get enough rest.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah, it's super important for keeping all those happy chemicals balanced.
Mm-hmm.
The tip is to try to establish a consistent bedtime routine.
So like going to bed and waking up around the same time every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And their example is, I think we can all relate to this. It says, I sleep better when I turn off my phone before bed.
Yeah, that's so true.
I know, right?
The blue light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've talked about all of that,
Mm-hmm.
let's zoom out a little bit
Okay.
and look at happiness around the world.
Okay.
So the article mentions the World Happiness Report, and it says that in 2025, countries like Finland, Denmark, and Switzerland consistently rank at the top.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And some of the factors that seem to contribute to that are having access to good health care, a strong sense of community, and a high level of trust in their government.
Okay, so it's about the societal factors as well, not just individual.
I was just individual.
Yeah.
And then they also point out that how we understand happiness can be really different across cultures.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so for example, in a lot of Western cultures, there's this emphasis on individual achievement and personal success as like the sources of happiness. But in many Eastern cultures, happiness is often more connected to family harmony and collective well-being.
Right, the good of the group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they define harmony here as a state of peaceful agreement and balance. And they give the example, in my culture, happiness comes from family.
Right.
Which is really beautiful.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, so let's tackle some myths about happiness.
I love myth busting.
Me too.
All right, let's do it.
So the article busts 3 common myths. The first one is that money buys happiness.
Oh, yeah, we've all heard that one.
Right. Yeah. And as we already talked about, while it helps to have enough money to cover your needs and feel secure beyond that, the connection kind of fades away.
It's not a guarantee of happiness.
A guarantee.
Okay.
Myth number 2 is that happiness is always this big dramatic feeling.
Oh, okay.
But really, it's those small, everyday moments that are just as important.
Like those small joys we were talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then myth number 3 is that happy people don't feel sad.
Right.
But the truth is, everyone feels sad sometimes.
Yeah, it's part of being human.
It's part of being human.
Yeah.
And happiness is more about that overall balance.
Right.
You know, it's about resilience.
Yeah, be able to bounce back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the example they give is, I was sad yesterday, but today I feel happy again.
Yeah.
So it's okay to have a range of emotions. You don't have to be happy all the time.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right.
So let's bring it back to you, our listener, and remember that this article is designed to be especially helpful for people who are learning English. And it makes this really cool connection between learning English and happiness.
Interesting.
It explains that learning a language can actually boost those happy brain chemicals we were talking about earlier.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So think about it. Like when you learn a new word, you get that little hit of dopamine because you've achieved something.
Right. Like a sense of accomplishment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you make progress in English and you start to understand more, that can boost your serotonin.
Okay.
Which makes you feel more confident.
Yeah, for sure.
And then when you actually get to connect with other people who speak English, you know, you feel that sense of belonging.
Right.
And that's connected to oxytocin.
Right.
So it's framing language learning as something that's not just academic or practical, but actually something that can really contribute to your well-being.
That's awesome.
And the article even suggests, you know, if you want to really kind of reinforce that connection, say out loud, I'm happy because I'm learning English.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a good affirmation.
It is.
Yeah.
But, you know, of course, it's not always easy to be happy.
Right.
The article also acknowledges that. And it talks about how things like stress, loneliness, and health problems
those are tough.
can all make it harder to feel happy.
Right, because they can really throw those brain chemicals off.
Yeah, exactly. And it also normalizes the idea of asking for help.
Oh, that's so important.
If you need it. They even give you a phrase to use in English.
Right.
If you feel sad for a long time, it's okay to ask for help. In English, we say, I need support.
Yeah.
And they explain that support just means help. So
if you're struggling, reach out.
Reach out.
Yeah.
It's okay to ask for help.
Yeah. And, you know, the last thing that the article touches on is the future of happiness science.
Oh, cool.
So apparently there's a lot of research going on using things like brain scans and apps to really understand happiness on a deeper level and maybe even find new ways to increase happiness.
Interesting.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today,
I think the main takeaway is that happiness isn't just this vague idea. It's this fascinating mix of biology and the choices that we make.
Right.
And for you, our listener, especially if you're learning English, remember that you're already doing something that can contribute to your happiness. You know, you're learning, you're growing,
Yeah, yeah.
and you're connecting with other people.
Right.
All through this process of language learning.
I love that.
So it's a really positive thing.
Yeah.
So
Happiness is not just a destination.
not a destination.
It's a journey.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
So thinking about everything that we've explored today, what's one small thing that you can do today
Yeah.
to boost your own sense of joy and well-being?
Right. What's one action you can take?
Yeah. Will you reach out to someone you care about? Will you go for a walk in nature?
Yeah.
Will you take a few moments to be grateful? Or will you just appreciate the fact that you're learning English right now? Think about how those things, your relationships, your health,
Yeah.
your sense of purpose, even just a small moment of gratitude,
Right.
how all of that can play a role in your happiness today.
That's a great point to end on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this was awesome.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.